Ask and you shall receive. This video is my reply or my answer to many of the comments that were left on my last video, which was all about the Shure level lock. And I had mentioned in that video that I first learned about the Shure level lock and the magic in the Shure level lock from producer engineer David Fridmann. And it quickly became apparent as I was reading through the comments that there were many other David Fridmann fans out there. And many of you asked me to talk a little bit more about the time I got to intern with David Fridmann at his Tarbox Road Studios when the Flaming Lips were in there doing their album Zaireeka and then later their album The Soft Bulletin. So, as I said, ask and you shall receive. Today I'm going to talk about 10 big lessons I learned from David Fridmann and the Flaming Lips. For those of you out there who may not be very familiar with David Fridmann, he's an influential engineer, producer, and mixer who's probably best known for his work with the Flaming Lips, but he's also mixed some really important records for Tame Impala. He's worked with MGMT, OKGO, Weezer, Nick Cave, all kind of really great sonically minded kind of major indie artists. And so for those of us who follow him, he's a bit of a legend, but he flies under a lot of people's radars because he's just not somebody who's out in the spotlight very much. You don't see him doing online courses. You don't see him hawking gear. He doesn't even do that many interviews. He really just kind of hangs out in his super cool studio out in the middle of nowhere, working with some of the most interesting artists on earth, making super sonically adventurous, groundbreaking records. And hey, if you got that as your lifestyle, why do you ever need to leave the house? If you are new here, I am David Peters. We're at my studio, Oak House Recording in Los Angeles, and I've been making records with people for about 30 years now. And also about 10 years ago, I went and got myself certified and have been also working as a personal coach, what a lot of people call a life coach. And I'm only mentioning that because as you watch through this video, you're going to notice that I am peppering in all kind of life philosophy stuff into all the studio talk. And I just wanted you to understand where that was all coming from. So that's who I am. That's where you are. Let's go talk some David Fridmann. So the first question I should probably address here is how did I even get to intern with David Fridmann? Well, way back when I was attending a recording program at a university called SUNY Fredonia in Western New York, and that's the same program that David Fridmann had gone through years before. But now he was kind of returning to the area to put down roots and to build his own studio. But luckily for me, he also ended up teaching one of our recording classes. But then on the first day of class, we all sat down and he asked us to kind of play some things for him that we've been working on so he kind of knew where we were and what interested us and all that stuff. And then after that, he said, would you like to hear what I've been working on? And we all politely said, yeah, sure. But then he played an early mix of something off of the Flaming Lips Zaireeka record. And I was instantly blown away. My jaw hit the floor. Within 5 seconds, I knew that it was my mission in life to spend as much time up there in that room watching whatever was happening as I possibly could. And so afterward, I asked him, hey, can I please do my intern hours at your studio? And in a very David Fridmann casual way, he said, yeah, sure. Tarbox Road Studio was just getting started at that time. David and a couple of friends had purchased this kind of half-finished barn-style house up this kind of remote country road up in the woods on this rough little dirt road that was really hard to find. And remember that this was kind of the time where analog recording was still the main way of recording, but the digital revolution was just starting to happen. So the studio was primarily built around an old Otari MTR 90 24-track tape machine. He also had an Otari Concept Elite mixing console. It had a lot of decent automation on it, but it also had this snapshot recall system where the console would record the settings across the entire board. Eventually, there was also a digital radar recording system in there. I don't know if that was there from this point on or if it came in a little later, but there was a radar there at some point. Other notable gear in the studio, there was a single U47, there was a EMT 140 plate reverb downstairs, There were a couple 1176s. There were several Eventide H3000 effects boxes, which David was an absolute master of those things. There were also a lot of really strange oddities in the racks, things that you had never heard of or wouldn't expect to see there, but we'll get more into that a little later. And then other than that, just your basic assortment of some workhorse microphones and just studio basics. There was a control room, a kitchen, a live room, and then off on the side of the live rooms were several isolation booths. The live room was the full height of a 2-story house, so the room was pretty high. So half of the house, or maybe like a third of the house, had the full 2-story open barn style vibe. And then there was the control room in the on the other side, and above the control room there were some bedrooms. People could come and stay and sleep there. And that's pretty much the layout of the studio. There was a really nice patio all along the front where you could sit out and look out to the woods, and I just remember sitting out there with the Flaming Lips guys listening to some really interesting stuff. Steven would love to just sit out there and listen to some crazy, really interesting interviews or music and stuff he just used for inspiration. So I have a lot of good memories of that. But it was a really beautiful, serene, remote house in the middle of nowhere that was just really purpose built.
1, 2, 1.
As I mentioned before, the Flaming Lips were there a lot in those days working on their Zaireeka record, and it's worth taking a moment to talk about that record because it's a pretty unique record. Wayne had also been doing what he called the parking lot concerts or the boombox experiments. Wayne would distribute a whole bunch of cassette tapes with different sounds or musical parts on them and stuff, and people would put them all in their stereo systems, and then Wayne would sit in the middle and conduct when people should start or stop their tapes and how to bring up the volumes and down the volumes. It's almost like an orchestra conductor. So they kind of wanted to do the same thing with Zaireeka. So they came up with this idea that Zaireeka, the songs on Zaireeka were going to be spread between 4 different CDs. And I don't mean different songs on different CDs. I mean the same song, but different parts of each song were on 4 different CDs. And you had to get 4 CDs together, all your systems in a circle pointing in at you and your friends, and everyone would have to press play on the CD at the same time, and then the album would come out of all 4 systems simultaneously. That is a pretty wild concept.
Get ready. 1, 2, 3, 4, go!
Okay, so with all that groundwork laid, now it's time to get into the 10 lessons I learned from David Fridmann and the Flaming Lips. And as I go through them, I want to invite you to ask yourself how each of them applies to you, what you're doing, how you work. And if you would, not just for your own benefit, asking yourself, but if you come up with something you think is interesting or that anyone else would enjoy, please leave a message down in the comments and tell your story. I really want to hear them just for my own sake, because otherwise I'm here alone in my room talking at a camera. But I think that everyone else who's interested in this video might be interested to share these stories, and we can kind of create a bit of a group experience, kind of like the Flaming Lips were trying to do with the 4 CDs of Zaireeka.
It became apparent that it was going to cost an unbelievable amount of money to go to any recording studio that could technically handle what we needed to do. So we decided to build a studio instead.
So a 4 CD collective experience album, that's a bold move. Building a studio in an old house in the middle of nowhere, especially at that time in the late 90s, that was a bold move, especially before everyone was on computers and the internet, and then paying for it with a stack of credit cards and some vague promises of future work with the Flaming Lips because, they were signed to Warner Brothers, but hey, how guaranteed is any of that stuff in the world, right? And this wasn't the first time that such bold moves had worked out for them. Before Tarbox even existed, David and the Flaming Lips had worked together before, and the first time they had worked together was recording an album called In a Priest-Driven Ambulance. And the story behind that is, at least according to Wikipedia, is that the Lips had about a budget of $10,000 to work with, and they paid David Fridmann $5 an hour to engineer the record. But the rumors were that, they were recording at night when school was not in session. So during the day when school was in session, they were actually upstairs crashing in what was called Studio C during the day. And Studio C was not a normal studio, however, with like a normal control room and stuff. Studio C was an anechoic chamber. It was acoustically isolated from the rest of the building, and then internally it was all absorption on all sides. And when you closed the door to that room, you heard nothing from the outside, and you could barely hear anything on the inside. There were no reflections. You would speak and your own voice would not come back to you. It was a deeply uncomfortable space to be in. Then of course we would play games with each other and turn off the lights, and that got even creepier in that particular space. So imagine spending the days crashing in Studio C, only to emerge at night to come down and sneak into the university studios and make a record. So let me just interject a quick little personal story here to drive this point home a little more. And it's a story I like to tell because it's kind of fun, but it makes me feel special and stuff like that. When I was in the meeting applying to get into the Fredonia recording program, they asked me what classical instrument I played because that was a requirement for the program. But I didn't play a classical instrument. And I played a little bit of guitar, but their guitar path was all filled up. There was no space there. And I didn't know any of this, and so that means I wasn't going to get into the program, and I was super bummed. But then I remembered in that meeting, they also said that they didn't really have any cello players coming in, and that they were really desperate for cello players. So I thought, aha! I spent the rest of the summer teaching myself the cello out of a Mel Bay cello book, and then I went in and auditioned on cello instead. So when I was done with the audition, the professor asked me, hey, who taught you how to play the cello? I told her kind of what I was doing, and she goes, okay, you don't know how to properly play a cello, so I cannot let you into this program. But you showed a lot of tenacity in what you're trying to pull off here. Let me go talk to everyone and see what they say. And they came back with something called a conditional acceptance, which simply meant that I could join the program right away, but that I would have to take lessons for a year and re-audition before the following year. And that's exactly what happened, and that's how I snuck my way into the recording program on the cello. But I'm only sharing this story because it just drives this point home again that sometimes, not always, but sometimes if you take a bit of a bold move, you might just wander into a loophole you didn't know existed and get where you wanted to go. And I'm bringing this as rule number one, really because, creativity is hard. Right? Making a record is hard, but also finding ways to get your art made, that's also really hard. And sometimes just to have a chance to be in a studio and get something to happen takes some bold moves and exploiting some loopholes. And I'm sure everyone out there has some fun stories kind of around that. If you do have a fun story about how you got something done that shouldn't have been able to get done, please share it in the comments below. I think not just me, but everyone else watching this video or reading the comments would love to hear it and kind of see from everyone else that this kind of happens a lot out there. So much in life is just about opportunities, just having opportunities, being given opportunities, right? Or recognizing opportunities when they are being given to you, and then being willing and able to take on opportunities that you are given. Because I accidentally found that loophole, I got into the school. Because I got into the school, I met David Fridmann. Because I met David Fridmann, I learned a ton about recording, but I also got some connections I could take with me as I moved out into the world. I had a more interesting backstory, right? Something I could take with me, and that helped me get business in Los Angeles. That helped me get over to the UK and get my licensing deal over there. All of these are, again, stacking opportunities one on another like compound interest. Tarbox Road was able to exist because David had taken on the opportunity of working with the Flaming Lips in the ways we just talked about. The Flaming Lips took on opportunities that got them in the room with Warner Brothers. David Fridmann had access to the studios where they first recorded the Flaming Lips because he took the opportunity of going to school at Fredonia, right? So this is just a list of random opportunities, but you can see how they kind of stack up on each other, right? One leads to the next, leads to the next. So I have been asked before what David Fridmann is like, just as a guy. Well, he's kind of quiet, understated. He's casual. He usually has this disarming, kind of zen-like grin on his face, He has a special knack for being presented with kind of an impossible problem or an unrealistic request, and very calmly just saying, yeah, let's try something. He's definitely someone with opinions and preferences, but he tends not to throw them around a lot. He likes to let things kind of play out in the room and just to see what kind of naturally rises to the top, which is super cool. He is also one of the most outwardly patient people I have ever met. So I just told you my cello story, right? Well, because I was interning up there at the studio and because David knew I was somehow associated with the cello, he called me up one day and asked me to come play cello on a record he was working on. And now remember, keep in mind, I didn't really know how to play the cello. And remember that this is before the time of digital recording with all the comping and auto-tuning and all the stuff you can do today, right? So I sat there and did my best for what felt like 100 takes. And I can only imagine how disappointed and frustrated they must have been in the control room with what I was turning out. But never once did he make me feel that way. My whole experience was just seeing through the glass his calm zen grin, and his calm voice saying, "Let's try another one back at this section." And that just went on for a while. And I cannot tell you how grateful I was for that. Because, that was probably my greatest and most impactful other side of the glass moment, right? It's just one of those times I learned that how important it is to recognize that everyone on the other side of the glass is in an extremely vulnerable position. They are very exposed. They're probably very self-conscious. So I take it as a high compliment when anyone in the studio ever tells me, "Hey, thanks for that. You made me feel really comfortable. You took away my anxiety," or you made it a relaxed atmosphere. It's not just that it's nice. It's not just that it's nice for people. Oftentimes that slow march forward is actually the fastest way to get to where you need to go. Okay, let's take a minute to talk about the Zaireeka sessions themselves. One thing that really stood out to me during those sessions was how unprecious everyone was about the particular instruments and stuff that they were using. So, for example, I think they had one kind of average quality acoustic guitar. I think it was the one that Wayne would just use live on stage. They had one electric guitar that I remember seeing. I think it was like the one electric guitar they had used on all of the last few albums or something like that. So I just want to interject quickly, and because I forgot to mention that they kind of had a no guitar rule for a lot of Zaireeka and the soft Bulletin, because they were trying to force themselves to find other types of solutions and kind of keep themselves out of their safety zone.
We're going to have to figure out some other way to get that emotional impact, to get that visceral impact coming out of the speakers and communicate this feeling, but not like that.
The drum set was kind of beat up looking. The MIDI controller, I think I remember there being tape all over it or paint all over it or drawings or something. It was either like an art project or something that was pulled out of a dumpster. That's kind of how it looked to me. And so they didn't spend a lot of time doing things like, changing the strings on their guitars or choosing the exact guitar to get the exact sound or moving the mic position ever so much. There was really none of that. And it wasn't that they didn't care. It's that their focus was on something else, some other piece of the puzzle. So they seem to be way more focused on, hey, we've got some inspiration, let's get our ideas down quickly. Or, hey, okay, we want this sound, and that sounds nice, but we're not looking for correct, we're looking for compelling. Let's make something compelling. And sometimes that was just, it didn't matter if you had a super fancy microphone on it or not. In fact, maybe that's not what you wanted at all.
Which seemed crazy at the time, like, you're going to take something off a cassette deck and turn that into the basis of your song in your studio? That's what you're going to do? And when that's almost what we do every single time now.
They're also focused on just making sure that the concept of the song was being expressed through the music. So it was really interesting to watch, especially for me, because I'm someone who can really get caught up in each individual piece of gear. And I've really collected and curated the collection over the 30 years I've been doing this. But then whenever something new comes in, something old goes out, okay? David is the opposite. I don't think he's ever sold anything he's ever owned. If you look in his racks at the studio, or if you look at the gear list on his website, you'll still see things like Alesis 3630 compressor, right? And the 3630, for those of you who know, is a universally loathed, like, live sound compressor that people didn't even like to use for live sound, but there it is in the racks. But knowing David, he knows that there's some secret hidden magic in the 3630, and he knows how to, pull it out of that box, and that's why it's still in the racks. So they weren't precious about the fanciness of anything, but they were quite interested in the flavor of things or the potential flavor of things. Psst. I am going to share a David Fridmann gear story. Once upon a time, young David, me, was trying to get a very Fridmann-esque blown up drum sound on a mic that I had on a drum kit, but I didn't have any cool distortion boxes. I didn't have guitar pedals or anything at that point I had thought to use. And so I asked Dave what I should do, and he knew what I had laying around, and he said, well, what about that old graphic EQ for your PA system? I said, yeah, I don't know what you mean. He goes, run your signal through it, jack up all the EQ faders, run your input a bit hot, and it'll distort. So I did that, and it was pretty cool. And then I told him, I think the 3K is a little harsh. I think the kick drum's blown up a little more than I want. He goes, well, just pull those faders down. There you go. Shapeable, inexpensive, super cool blowing up of a microphone, courtesy of David Fridmann, for a piece of equipment that you can go out and get for 40 or 50 bucks. Okay, this is just one of those examples of don't be too precious about where your flavoring comes from. There is magic in these humble little boxes if you know how to find it. Who out there remembers the old TV show MacGyver? MacGyver, as a character, had the reputation of being able to solve kind of any crisis using whatever materials were laying around him in any random place. That's MacGyver, and that's what we mean when people say MacGyvering, right? So David Fridmann was probably one of the few engineers I met who was even more MacGyver than MacGyver. In fact, sometimes I call him Fridgyver. We all know that sometimes staying creative in the studio can get pretty tough. And especially if you're trying to break some new ground sonically or come up with something a bit unique to set yourself apart, like where do you go to come up with brand new whatever? Well, there's basically two ways you can go. The first is kind of the throw the paint against the wall approach. That's maybe when you take something, take your sound and you run it through a fun box, like something like this. This is a Chase Bliss Mood guitar pedal, but it creates all kinds of fun, beautiful mayhem and trickery and stuff, and that's really cool, and that's a timeless way to go about things, and it's totally legit. This is the world of happy accidents.
That was a freebie.
The problem with this game is that everyone else can play it, and it kind of levels the playing field with finding new stuff, and you can kind of, it's very easy to get lost in the crowd, right? The second path you can go, and this is the road less traveled, is to understand the core principles of audio, or the gear you're working with, or of song arrangement. Just the core principles, you understand them so deeply that if somebody gives you a crazy request or an impossible task, you can actually, very much like MacGyver or Fridgyver, you can sit there and create or concoct a path to get to the desired result. You can manifest somebody's idea by just thinking it through, just like David Fridmann did when he looked at my graphic equalizer and was able to figure out that, hey, this is a path to getting where you want to go. The Flaming Lips are famous for their big, bombastic, John Bonham-esque drum sounds. But the funny things about those sounds, both for the Flaming Lips and for John Bonham, is that they were captured quite simply. Because I think it's pretty common practice, I will share how the kind of some of those drum sounds were captured. So in the corner of the Tarbox Road live room was this, what they called like the reflective corner. Kind of tile on the ground, but the entire corner was super reflective. And they would just stick the drums in this reflective corner where every time you hit the drum, the sound would just bounce off the wall and shoot out the front, okay? And then I just remember one microphone being above the drum kit and one microphone being out in front of the kick drum. And then of course they would compress that up and blow it up, and that's how you got those massive, giant, cool drum sounds on those records. And so now I employ similar techniques in the studio today. I don't think about putting 100 mics on something if I can get away with putting one or two on it. And then instead of relying on reverbs and delays and stuff to set things in space later in the mix, I will think, okay, I want this to be in the room, so I will just back the instrument away from the microphone, or I want this to be right up in my face, and I bring it closer to the microphone. And simple things like that. Simple can be powerful, and use the room are definitely two things I learned just simply from watching them capture drums. Because I am a total nerd who works in the coaching world sometimes, whenever I have a thought that I kind of want to remember and consolidate, I will put it on a t-shirt. So I am wearing my Emergent system t-shirt that I make. Anyway, the point of me wearing this t-shirt is that, simply put, an emergent system is something that when it comes together becomes more than the sum of its parts. And this was extremely apparent watching David Fridmann and the Flaming Lips work in the studio. They were all very different people in a way, but it was these puzzle pieces that came together that really made everything work. You had David Fridmann, who was the quiet, competent, gear nerd, techie person. You had Wayne philosophizing in the back, singing, writing the songs, providing all the wonder and whimsy to things. You had Steven, who was kind of the musical brains behind the whole thing. He would come down and just instantly map out string arrangements or play the guitar, go in and do the Bonham drums, and it was incredible. You had Michael, who's kind of the sweet, quiet glue of the whole operation, and he was also really technically interested, so he was over there working with David Fridmann on a lot of the technical side of things. And then you had the 90s, where it was the end of all analog, moving into the digital world, and those tools that were kind of coming in. And then you had the input from Warner Brothers. You had all the experiments and their history they had done. You had everything that was happening with them in their lives. And of course, that all mixes together in a pot. And that's how those albums were born. So I couldn't do this video without sharing my own personal contribution to the Zaireeka album. It's a very important contribution. My friend Andy and I were up in the studio during one of the mixing sessions, and there's a song on there where most of the actual music itself is coming out of the main front set of the 4 speakers, and the other 3 sets were saved for playing these really high-pitched sine waves. That's these really pure tones at really awful frequencies like 13 or 14 kilohertz, and that just drill into your ear, right? Everyone else left the room except for Andy and I, and our job was to, as these tones came up in volume, is when they got so uncomfortable that we would want to leave the room or stop listening to the song, we were supposed to raise our hands. And we did that, and it was uncomfortable, and we raised our hands, and that's how the volumes of those tones were set on Zaireeka. You're welcome. A lot of the magic comes from being stuck in a space where there's nothing else to focus on but what you're working on, with people, and the ups and downs of all that, where there's some real true intimacy going on. I think that's where a lot of the magic of a lot of your favorite records come from, are just from those situations and those moments. And just to make sure to remember to put yourself in situations like that so that emergent systems can happen.
Why don't we just do something completely absurd?
If I was going to put a star next to one of these lessons, this would be the one. Probably the biggest lesson I learned from watching the Flaming Lips and David Fridmann work on those records is the same lesson I've been trying to learn for myself for decades now, which is, how do I stay in a state of open, curious playfulness and creativity while also being technical and thinking about my performance chops and making sure that the arrangement's going well? There's this kind of brain side and this kind of heart side. And trying to keep both of those afloat in the air at the same time, it is one of the absolute hardest things to do. And it's something that David Fridmann and the Flaming Lips really found a way to do. So, and I think part of how they did that was just, it was okay to fail in the room. Everyone could bring forward an idea. Everyone was willing to try the ideas that were put forward. And it would either fail or succeed based on the merits. And 90% of the time, things would fail.
And then it'd be like, well, that's cool. And you work on it for a couple days, and what if everything was totally different?
But everyone in the room was cool with that. Let's try it. David would always say, let's try it. After he was given an impossible task, he would just always say, okay, let me try something. They just really focused on staying interested, honestly and earnestly interested in what they were doing, and staying light and playful about it. When the Zaireeka album was released, there was an album release party at Tarbox Road Studios. And instead of trying to crowd everyone who was there into the control room to listen on the studio monitors, we instead set up 4 PA systems out in the woods off to the side of the studio. Then we all hung out in the woods and listened to Zaireeka play on these 4 PA systems. And I just thought that was a super fun and unique way to celebrate the release of the album, and just another example of how everything was kind of novel play and just staying in that state. As I believe it's supposed to say on the Temple of Apollo, know thyself. We've been talking a lot about things like playfulness and boldness and all this kind of stuff. But it's good to keep in mind that all this plays out very differently for each and every one of us. We are not the same. And even if we have a hero or a mentor that kind of carves some path through life, that may not be a path that's open to us. Or maybe it's not a path we should take, even if it is open to us. So it all arrived in a bit of a moment of epiphany, but it occurred to me that my path led west, and I had to get off of this path that I was very set on walking, okay? And that came as a big surprise to me. So as I was driving to Tarbox for one of the last times to kind of finish up my time there, who do I see walking on the side of the road out in the middle of the countryside but Wayne? And he was wearing his white suit you often see him wear up on stage. And I pick up Wayne and we drive back to the studio. And I tell them, hey, I'm going to be moving to Los Angeles. Now, they were not LA guys. They were very decidedly not into that kind of scene. So they kind of gave me a sweet, are you sure you want to do this kind of talk? And as part of that talk, they kind of gave me a funny speech about, if things don't go well, whatever you do, don't turn to porn. Don't go into porn. And it's hard to forget the Flaming Lips giving you a speech about not going into porn when you go to LA. But it was just one of those very memorable moments that reminds me that no matter how much we think we know our path or even know ourselves, sometimes surprises come. And it really pays dividends to spend some time asking yourself, what really are my opportunities? What really is my temperament? What really is my place in all of this? And how do I fit into all of this? And spending some extra time doing that can really pay dividends. The best piece of gear that you can have is not a fancy microphone. It's not a Neve preamp. It's not an 1176. The best piece of gear that you can have when you walk in the studio is a great philosophy. Again, because I spend a piece of my life in the coaching world, I spend time kind of boiling down basic big picture concepts into little things so I can share them with people. So I'm going to share one with you today, which is just kind of my general basic equation for life. And there are only 2 variables in this equation. The first variable is posture, and the second variable is orientation. Okay? What do I mean by that? Posture is just the way you walk, the way you carry yourself in the world as you're doing what you're doing. And orientation is just what's your goal? What are you chasing? What are you after? Where are you walking? All right? What are you walking toward? So how in the hell does this relate to the Flaming Lips? I think that David Fridmann and the Flaming Lips were able to make so many amazing records and have a good time doing it and live out in the middle of nowhere in this awesome studio and have all these opportunities because they put great variables into these equations. Okay, so for the posture variable, the way they carried themselves, I think of that open state of playfulness with an eye to standards. Okay? This is just the way they were. They were eternally curious. They were eternally open. Okay? It was just a temperament almost. It was just baked into the personalities. It wasn't necessarily even a conscious choice. They were just that, or they had learned to be that, right? And so they had a fantastic posture. And as far as orientation, like what their goal was, at least in the studio, and at least for Zaireeka, they really had the goal of, because they were doing that 4 CD set, right, where you had to get people together to experience music. I think they were looking to bring people together to have a positive musical experience that would make them wonder and think and communicate and talk. And so I think they were always trying to elevate the listener. I think they were always trying to elevate the state of the art they were making itself. Okay? Not a bad posture, not a bad orientation, not bad results. So as you look at the items on this list, you might be thinking to yourself, David, I already do these things. That is my posture. Those are my goals. I'm an artist just like they are. And your vague, wish-washy mindsets are no guarantee of success, right? I would agree with you, but I would also invite you to think of it not in terms of on or off or yes or no, but in how many layers deep have you gone? Are there any stones laying around here that you haven't turned over yet? We might be one opportunity away from really getting something moving, and that opportunity could be right in front of you if you'd only look another time. So it's kind of a dream for all of us, right? All of us would love to be doing what they are doing. So how are they doing that? That is far more important than, hey, the Shure level lock is really cool. But the Shure level lock is really cool. Let's also be honest. That's also fun to look into. But paying attention to the bigger philosophical lessons can really help us all get closer to where we want to go. So if you liked or disliked this video, please tell me why in the comments below, or leave a like. Please subscribe to the channel if you like this kind of content, or if you like the gear videos and other stuff I have been doing. Feel free to check out what I do in the studio at okhouserecording.com. There's also my own music. There's my coaching stuff. You can check out all kind of stuff there. And that's it. I hope, again, you found some value here. I've got a really fun video coming up for the next one. It's a bit complicated to work out, but I'm excited for it. So with that, that's all I got. I'm out of here.